Okay, let's do this. Hey, what's up guys? Today we are taking an extremely detailed look at the gaming capability of the new budget mobile CPU, the Intel i3-1315U, which comes with an Intel Iris Xe-based integrated UHD graphics card with 64 EUs or execution units. In this case, I was using a rather cheap entry-level office laptop, the Lenovo V17, which came with 16GB of DDR4 3200 MHz RAM. If the CPU is combined with faster DDR5 RAM, the gaming performance should of course be better than what you're gonna see today. But right now, these combinations unfortunately aren't available in Europe, at least yet. And of course, if you're only using 8GB of single channel RAM, the results will be worse, especially in your games that need more VRAM and system RAM. PS, I'm also planning to review this specific laptop, which will actually start at around $400 depending on the configuration, and it's actually a pretty decent entry-level laptop for everyday tasks. The CPU itself has 2 performance cores with up to 4.5 GHz and 4 efficiency cores, whereas the performance cores provide hyperthreading, resulting in a total of 8 threads. The 4 efficiency cores are supposed to be as fast as an older Intel 6000 series generation mobile CPU from like 6 to 7 years ago. All games have been recorded with a separate PC, so there was no performance loss due to the recording. Some games really surprised me, but due to the rather bad Intel drivers, the performance often wasn't as good as the 3D Mark Firestrike graphics score suggests. But even with such a low-level CPU, you can absolutely have a nice time with older and lighter games. The games will be presented in alphabetical order, so you can quickly find your favorite game with the help of the timestamps. And without further ado, let's just start with these benchmarks.
Because I wasn't sure if the CPU could handle the newest Assassin's Creed versions, I actually started with Assassin's Creed 2 with medium settings at 1080p and saw an average FPS of 51 with a 1% low of 24 FPS. It's been a pretty popular game back in the day and was perfectly playable on this cheap laptop with mostly good frame times, though there were a few short stutters here and there. Nonetheless, I would approve playing this title on this laptop. I also tried to play Assassin's Creed Origins, but that didn't work as expected. Even on 720p and low settings, the FPS often dropped to around 15 when I was near the city Alexandria, in which a considerable amount of the game takes place. Out in the wild, it was okay with around 35 FPS, but as you can see here, the game is unfortunately unplayable in crowded areas. This is either driver related or game related, but I don't think that it will be fixed in the future, though faster RAM might help a bit in this case. So I was quite surprised that Assassin's Creed Valhalla was actually somewhat playable with around 26 FPS when I was using 720p in low settings with an additional resolution scaling of 60%. The game surely starts to look quite blurry, but it still might be acceptable for some people on a rather small laptop screen, I guess. But I wouldn't really recommend buying the game specifically if a laptop like this is your only gaming computer. Though I have to point out that the frame times have been surprisingly consistent. Playing Anno 1800 on lower frame rates is absolutely alright, considering it's a rather slow-paced game. At 1080p plus FSR balanced and low settings, I saw around 25 to 30 FPS in most cases, while it's still looking good enough. I personally would play this title that way, especially if you're using a dedicated mouse, that is. Though be aware that if you're only having 8GB, it might not run that fast. I was using 720p and low settings for Apex Legends, which resulted in a pretty okay average FPS of around 48 and a 1% low of around 26. There were a few short stutters here and there, but I guess you can't really be that picky with a laptop like that. Of course, more sophisticated players would not consider playing that game this way, but since it's free to play, you might give it a try. The new low-spec Battlefield rival Battlebit was running pretty well at 1080p and low settings, with an average of around 70 FPS and a 1% low of 34 FPS on a 254 player map. This game is most certainly designed for potato laptops like this one, while still providing captivating Battlefield-like gameplay. I just really sucked at playing it the first time, as you can see here, here and here. Though, if you're into games like that, the $15 for the game would be a good investment even on an entry-level Intel i3 system. But if you can't stand the pixel graphics of Battlebit, you could actually try to play a round of Battlefield 4, which ran surprisingly well at 720p in low settings. I had a really good experience with around 90 FPS on average and a pretty high 1% low of almost 60 with basically no stuttering at all and a super smooth frame time graph as shown in the OSD on the left side here. PS, I wasn't able to start Battlefield 2042, the new version, as it would unfortunately just time out on every attempt to start a match. Bioshock Infinite was perfectly playable at 1080p and the low graphics presets with 60 FPS on average and a solid 1% low of 39 FPS. If you are into single-player first-person story shooters, I would actually recommend playing this great game on this integrated GPU if you haven't already done that, and it should actually even work as well with only 8GB of RAM. You could also play this at like 900p and medium or 720p and high settings alternatively. I was also trying the VU emulation with CEMU and fired up Mario Kart 8, which ran perfectly fine with 60 FPS on average once all the shaders had been loaded for the first time. As the GPU is quite bored with around 40%, you could even consider graphics mods and raise the resolution to 1080p, I guess. The same applied to Super Mario 3D World, which also ran with a perfectly stable 60 FPS on average and a 1% low of 55 FPS. But once more, you would need some patience until all shaders have been loaded and activated for the first time, which would always cause a small stutter, as you can probably see in the footage that I'm presenting. I tested City Skylines at 900p and medium settings, which isn't the best experience to be honest. You could of course use 720p and low settings, but the game really starts to look blurry due to its bad anti-aliasing implementation. If you're hardcore and okay with that low frame rate, it might be okay, I guess. I was running the integrated benchmark for Civilization 6 with 1080p and medium settings. And the average turn time on the AI benchmark was 9.5 seconds, and the average FPS for the graphic benchmark was 29 FPS. Since this game is turn-based, such low FPS numbers are perfectly fine in my opinion, so if you're into Civilization 5 or 6, this would be a great budget laptop to play these games. I also tried to run Call of Duty Warzone 2, which just like Battlefield 2042 resulted in a timeout while starting a match every time. So I guess by this point it has to be considered unplayable. I was really surprised how good Control ran at 1080p with 720p resolution scaling and low settings while still looking acceptable. The average FPS were around 43 with a 1% low of 22 FPS. I mean, the frame times aren't really good, but for a third-person game it's still endurable if you're not expecting too much from a laptop like this. Of course, capping the FPS at 30 would be a good possibility to further soften the frame times, since there have been some stutters here and there. But still, I didn't expect it to be actually playable on an entry-level laptop, office laptop that is. Such games would definitely not have been playable on equivalent hardware a few years back. Cyberpunk 2077 is actually working, but it's more or less unplayable, since even at low settings and 720p plus Intel XeSS in performance mode, it only ran with around 25 FPS and a 1% low of 15 FPS, especially in crowded areas like this one, and also while driving, the FPS dropped to the low 20s, making navigating a torture. Standing still like this actually stabilizes the FPS at around 30 and the game actually looks okay, but really playing it, I guess that's more like a clear no. Unless you're really desperate and without any expectation. And yes, it can run Crysis. Though I was not able to use the Afterburner OSD, so we'll have to work with the Steam FPS overlay in that case. But at 1080p and medium settings, the FPS were pretty high with around 50 to 70 FPS, like all the time, and I didn't feel any stuttering. Back in the day when the game was released, it actually didn't run that good on probably even the stronger gaming systems. I tested CSGO at very low settings in 1080p and saw an average of around 85 FPS with a rather low 1% low of only 34 FPS, and as you can see here, I had more stutters than usually when testing this game. I don't know if this could be improved with further driver updates, since it actually should run a bit better than that in my opinion. As you can see in the OSD, the GPU hasn't even been fully utilized, even with the two pretty strong performance cores of the i3 1315U. In Diablo Immortal, I was testing the medium preset at 1080p, which was playable okay with around 38 FPS on average, but a rather bad 1% low of only around 18 to 21 FPS due to a rather wild frame time graph and quite some stuttering, which in this case isn't that disturbing really. But since this is a mobile game, I was expecting a playable performance after all. And 900p would be another option for some more FPS of course, as well as capping the FPS to soften the frame rate. PS, I don't have access to Diablo 4 right now, but Diablo 3 will work okay as well, in case you're wondering. PS, I would expect a similar performance with only 8GB of RAM in this case. Elden Ring was working okay in most areas with around 31 FPS on average at 720p and low settings. I mean, it is playable, but surely doesn't look that fabulous due to the, in my opinion, bad implementation of anti-aliasing. In some areas, the FPS will drop into the mid or high 20s, whereas in other regions, I was actually seeing something close to 50 FPS. But overall, I guess it's alright considering the hardware. Fall Guys ran perfectly fine with around 40 to 50 FPS on average, depending on the parkour I was in. Even the 1% low was pretty high with around 35 FPS, which is nice. Oh, and I was testing the game at 1080p with low settings. I really think you could absolutely win a round on this laptop without the hardware being a bottleneck. And since it's free to play, I mean, it's absolutely worth the download. It also should run just fine with only 8GB of RAM, by the way. I was actually able to play Far Cry 6 once I activated FSR on ultra quality mode combined with 720p and low settings, while it didn't look as blurry as I've expected. I saw an average of 38 FPS and a 1% low of 26 FPS. Could be worse, I guess. Of course, that's not the best scenario for a first-person shooter, but it's doable for a single-player game if you're willing to accept some limitations on this entry-level office hardware. FIFA 2023 wasn't starting on this laptop for some reason, so I've tested the 2022 version instead. It ran pretty well at 1080p and medium settings with deactivated MSAA. I saw an average of 55 FPS and a stable frame time graph. The bad 1% low was mostly due to the dropping frame rate in the cutscenes after a goal, so you can ignore that in this case. But overall, I'd recommend the experience on the i3 1315U, most likely even with only 8GB of RAM once more. Fortnite was kinda playable at 1080p in performance mode with around 73 FPS on average, but there was quite some stuttering which heavily affected the 1% lows. I'm not sure though if this issue would be resolved after a few matches when everything is correctly loaded for the first time. Such often happens when testing a game for the first time on a new PC. Since it's free to play, you could definitely give it a try if the download doesn't bother you, but be aware that 8GB of RAM would most likely significantly impact the playability. Since it's unfortunately impossible to run the Afterburner OSD in Forza Horizon 4, I had to rely on the integrated FPS counter in that case. The game was playable quite well at 720p and very low settings, with what seemed to be a constant 50 FPS and above. I also tested it on 720p and medium settings, which resulted in around 30 to 45 FPS in most scenarios and could still be considered okay while immediately looking a lot better. Running Forza Horizon 5 was a bit more complicated. At 1080p plus low settings and FSR on performance mode, I was getting an average of around 29 FPS but very low 1% lows of only 12 and heavy stuttering. More or less unplayable. So I also tested 1080p with very low settings and FSR in performance mode with an FPS cap at 30 FPS and saw a much more stable gameplay. I also compared AMD's FSR upscaling technology at ultra performance directly with Intel's XeSS in performance mode using the benchmark, and I have to say that AMD is definitely the winner performance-wise, while XeSS is looking a bit sharper here, I think. In PS, I wouldn't bother buying the game if you only use 8GB of RAM in your laptop. Genshin Impact was playable at 1080p on medium settings with activated FSR. I saw an average of around 36 FPS and a 1% low of 22. As I don't play the game personally, I have no opportunities to test other areas since I just can't reach them yet. Sorry, but I guess overall it should be okay since you still got options to lower both the resolution and the settings. God of War was one of the most disappointing games I've tested on the i3 1315U, as I was not able to get playable frame rates at 1080p with low settings and FSR on ultra performance mode, which basically renders the game below 720p. An average of only 21 FPS just isn't a lot of fun unless you're really masochistic, considering it looks even really blurry as well. So let's just have a look at the next game, shall we? I was testing GTA 5 at 900p with the normal settings and high textures. That resulted in an average of 47 FPS and a 1% low of 34. It's not amazing, but I guess it's absolutely playable. Graphical modding would of course further reduce the FPS, so I wouldn't waste any time on that, I guess. Overall, it was an okay experience and probably comparable to a mix between the PS3 and PS4 version of the game. Hunt Showdown really looks blurry at 720p with low settings, but it was kinda playable with an average of 42 FPS and an okay 1% low of around 26 FPS without seeing any noticeable stuttering for the most part. But the limited visual quality really isn't helping in recognizing hidden enemies, which could affect the gameplay in a clearly negative way. So I probably wouldn't bother buying it if this is your only gaming rig. And I guess 8GB would absolutely not be enough for this title. I wasn't expecting a lot from Hogwarts Legacy, and it didn't disappoint in disappointing me. At 1080p, low settings with FSR 2.0 at ultra performance, the game looks super blurry with a super low average FPS of only 22 FPS, which in this combination is a clear no thank you. I was not able to test 720p as it would not allow me to combine it with FSR, but considering it already looked so bad at 1080p, I wouldn't bother combining 720p with FSR in the first place, to be honest. So I would absolutely not recommend playing this game on the UHD integrated graphics in this case. In Horizon Zero Dawn, I had to combine 720p, low settings and FSR on balanced mode to achieve somewhat playable FPS of around 25 to 30 FPS, while once more trading that in for a terrible blurriness. Since the FPS often drop to the mid-20s, I would not bother playing the game that way. But I actually guess that this is driver related, as the game shouldn't be that demanding actually. Though maybe it's also CPU related, since the CPU was almost always fully utilized in that case, so further lowering the graphics doesn't really help. League of Legends, on the other hand, was perfectly playable at 1080p and medium settings, with around 106 FPS on average and a 1% low of 57 FPS. Nothing to complain here, but it really is one of today's lightest esport games around, I guess. It really runs on any potato out there, so let's just directly jump to the next title instead. Microsoft Flight Simulator was actually working to some extent at 720p and low settings with around 23 FPS, which actually isn't that bad in this game, as you usually don't have to react that quickly. Though I'm sure many of you would consider this unplayable, and I get why. It doesn't really look good with these settings, but I just wanted to give it a try, and well, to be fair, it started and it worked and it didn't crash, which isn't always the case on such low-end hardware. I was testing Minecraft at 1080p with 30 chunks visibility and 2x anti-aliasing, which resulted in an average of around 78 FPS after removing the frame cap and a 1% low of around 40 FPS. I guess that would be playable for most people, and I'm pretty sure you could install some mods due to the, in this case, 16GB of RAM and the fact that the CPU has a total of 8 threads. In Need for Speed Heat, I had to use 720p at low settings combined with a resolution scaling of 75%, which resulted in a super bad and blurry image quality and only 33 FPS on average. So in my personal opinion, Forza Horizon 4 or 5 would really be the better choice here if you're into racing games, as they just look a lot better. No Man's Sky was actually playable pretty okay at 1080p with low settings and a resolution scaling of 65%. I saw an average of 41 FPS and the 1% lows were affected by 2 really big stutters, but other than that, it was an okay experience. The FPS in space is even better, though I had no more fuel to try that again to show it to you, so you'll have to believe me, I guess. Overwatch 2 was working fine on first sight at 720p and low settings with an average of 68 FPS and mostly consistent frame rates even in heavier fights. Though as you can see, the frametime graph shows a lot of stuttering, which could be a deal breaker for most serious gamers in that case. The CPU seemed to be the bottleneck here with its only 2 performance cores. So I'm not sure if I could recommend playing it that way. Actually, in action, it didn't feel as bad as it looks here. So it's kinda up to you, and since it's free to play, well, you could give it a try, I guess. Portal 2 was mostly working perfectly fine in the tested levels at 1080p and medium settings without anti-aliasing. I saw a stable average of 59 FPS with a 60 FPS cap. The bad 1% low shown here was once more caused by a single freeze in the beginning of the recording. But I mean, the game was released 12 years ago, so it should run on potatoes, right? I was testing the adaptive resolution setting for Prey with a 50 FPS goal and medium settings, which seemed to work okay and still looks decent enough for an enjoyable experience. I can highly recommend this game personally if you haven't played it yet, and some of you might have grabbed it when it was available for free at the Epic Store a while ago, so that's okay. PUBG was running with 35 FPS on average at 720p and very low settings, though considering the Intel UHD graphics has a 2 to 3 times higher Firestrike graphics score than my old GeForce 840M, which I tested this game on a few years back, but didn't run significantly better. I'm assuming this is once more a driver issue. Please keep in mind that you probably won't be able to enjoy this game with 8GB like at all. Red Dead Redemption 2 looked terribly blurry at 720p and low settings, but medium textures with FSR on performance, though the FPS have actually been quite okayish with around 38 on average and a decent 1% low of 28 FPS. You probably could tinker around with FSR on balanced or even quality mode while capping the FPS at 30, which would probably help with the sharpness a bit. And it's also worth noting that the image quality severely suffers once you stop moving. Maybe you can see that here if the YouTube compression doesn't destroy it completely. But overall, I probably wouldn't recommend getting the game for the setup if you don't already own it. I was testing Rocket League at 720p and low settings, which resulted in a perfectly playable 113 FPS and a mostly nice frametime graph with some exceptional stutters. I guess that using a 60 FPS cap and higher resolution or higher settings is most certainly a good option that also helps with frame stability, but I wanted to show you the maximum possible FPS you could achieve in this game on the i3 1315U with its Intel Iris Xe based UHD integrated graphics. However, I actually expected the game to run at least okay. I was testing StarCraft 2 at 1080p and medium settings, which mostly resulted in an average of around 55 to 65 FPS at least if not that much was going on the screen. I'm pretty sure the FPS will drop a little on bigger multiplayer fights for sure, but you'd still have enough headroom with lowering the resolution and the settings, so I guess it's a safe bet for this one. Subnautica worked pretty okay with around 43 FPS on average at 720p and medium settings, and I would definitely call it an enjoyable experience once more. The 1% lows were at around 26 FPS, and I didn't notice any bigger stutters. Would I recommend this one on the i3? I guess that's a clear yes for me. Check out the game if you haven't already done that, unless you're afraid of big sea monsters in dark waters. The next title was a surviving game as well. And The Forest ran with an acceptable average of 39 FPS at 720p and low settings, while still providing okay graphics and an okay 1% low in my opinion. I mean, it's doable for sure, and the game felt pretty fluid most of the time. I didn't experience any severe stutters, and probably more people than we think play games like that with a similar graphical fidelity. Speaking of graphical fidelity, Trine 2 is a masterpiece in that category in my opinion. At 1080p and high settings, I saw a high average of 61 FPS with a good 1% low of around 43 FPS. And the game still looks fantastic up to this day with its unique illuminated graphic style. Absolutely playable in a perfect way on this budget-friendly office machine if you ask me. If it's ever on sale and you're using this CPU, I would highly recommend getting it if you're somewhat comfortable with puzzle/riddle jump and runs. And it's also a great game for two people to play at the same time, by the way. Valheim was providing a nice 34 FPS at 720p and medium settings with around 15 FPS for the 1% lows. It definitely looks a bit blurry, but since the game has a pixelated graphics style from the get-go, I guess that's okay for most players that enjoy this title. And I still enjoy the lighting atmosphere of this game even at 720p and medium settings for sure. I don't personally play Valorant, but it seemed to work perfectly fine at 1080p in the low preset with a high average FPS of 118 and a 1% low of 69 FPS. The frame time graph was mostly really flat and the game felt absolutely fluid. And since it's another free-to-play title, keeping that one on your hard drive is most certainly a good idea if you're into that kind of games. So, without further ado, let's just jump right to the next game. The next gen update for The Witcher 3 means a big impact on every system considering the performance. So on 720p and low settings, I only saw around 41 FPS on average, even when using the DirectX 11 mode, which to be honest was pretty disappointing. So I was also trying 900p with Intel's XeSS activated, which now resulted in only 32 FPS, so even lower, on average, and it looked significantly worse, so I would prefer 720p in that case for sure. Unfortunately, I was not able to get the old version to start, so we're almost done for today, and we'll now have a look at the last game for this video. For World of Warcraft, I was using 1080p and the graphics preset number 5, which probably could be considered a medium preset. As the FPS depends so much on the zone you're in, I can only give you an estimated average of around 40 to 60 FPS. But assume that in newer and graphically more demanding zones, it would drop a bit. And of course in rates as well. But since this laptop is sporting 16GB of RAM, installing a few add-ons should still provide okay frame rates, considering we still have some headroom for lowering the resolution or the settings by a bit.
Okay, that's all the games for today. Overall, the i3 1350U is clearly not being considered a gaming CPU by any means, but that doesn't mean that you could not have some fun with it, especially with older and lighter games. And being a gamer definitely isn't defined by the hardware or the kind of games that you play, as long as you're enjoying your free time with any game, really. This video was once more a hell lot of work to do and took me quite some days to finish, so Please consider liking the video if the content was helpful for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stuff like that, as well as budget laptop reviews and GPU comparisons. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye bye and tschüss. These 50 games benchmarks are killing me.